The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Castillo, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Creating a Municipal Broadband Network in Your Community. Today's webinar is being brought to you by HR Green, and in the next hour, you'll find out about the efforts now underway in many Colorado cities and counties to bring high-speed, affordable broadband to their communities. Before I turn it over to our panelists and jump into the content, let me first provide you with some direction on how to use GoToWebinar. Let's look at the GoToWebinar options for a moment. You can show or hide your control panel at the top of the toolbox with the red arrow. You can put your screen in full screen mode using the rectangle in the upper right of the toolbox. Attendees are muted during the webinar, but you can ask a question using the toolbox. To do so, click on the plus sign next to questions and type your question. Once you've typed in your question, click send. We'll be taking your questions at the end of your presentation, so feel free to send them in at any time. Excuse me 1 second, I was told that it didn't advance past the first screen. So you should be, Ed and Dave, do you see the slides on the screen?
Chris, I am seeing your first slide and a picture of me. Sorry about the confusion.
Okay, no problem. It'll just take me a second. Sorry about that.
Ah, there we go.
Okay, sorry about that. Looks like we got that out of the way. So again, here's the webinar instructions. All right, sorry about that hiccup. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists today. So myself, Chris Castillo, the moderator. I've had over 20 years of marketing and communications experience, and currently I'm a marketing communications specialist at HR Green. Our presenters are Dave Xela, the first presenter. He is currently a local governmental services manager for HR Green, and has been a public works director for 20 years at various Colorado cities. He's helped install hundreds of miles of municipal fiber infrastructure in Colorado, and helped pioneer Colorado's second major exemption from SB 152. Ed Barrett is our second presenter for today, and he is currently a director of broadband services at HR Green. He has over 10 years of broadband and telecom experience, has extensive interface with broadband and telecom carriers and municipalities, and has managed a telecom program implementation and market analysis. Just a little bit about HR Green. We're a multidisciplined professional services and construction firm offering planning, technical consulting, including broadband, engineering, environmental services, and construction to clients in diverse markets. Founded in 1913, HR Green is one of America's oldest design and construction firms, and we enjoy a long-standing reputation for environmental stewardship, public service, and technical excellence. Our firm now employs over 400 people in 9 states, including multiple offices in Colorado. Our multiple-faceted Colorado staff have served over 30 Colorado agencies in broad-based municipal engineering, including broadband implementation. Our 6 business lines provide comprehensive services in governmental services, transportation, water, energy, land development, and construction. Our staff here today are part of our governmental services business line, and we combine creativity with reliability to assist local governments achieve their goals for efficiency, service delivery, infrastructure management, and sustainable development. Our agenda for today, aside from our welcome and introductions, it's kind of a 2-part webinar. The first will discuss the broadband environment, followed by evaluating your broadband options. The last 15 minutes or so will be available for Q&A. So like I said before, feel free to send me any questions that you may have, and I'll ask our presenters for answers and insight toward the end. And now, starting us off, will be Ed Barrett. Ed?
Chris, thank you very much. I wanted to welcome everybody to our webinar today. As I look through the attendee list, I wanted to, first of all, take a moment to congratulate those individuals who've joined who recently passed their SB 152 referenda. You know, the state of Colorado is really setting the pace for local initiative, local control of broadband services. And I'm happy to welcome those who recently passed that significant hurdle. I believe that all of us are on this call because number one, that we believe that that our constituents, our communities are sending a message, and that two, we're not here to simply admire the problem and study it, but that we're here because we really want to spend time, energy, and establish a vision that helps us define and solve it. We do want to be clear as an organization that while your objective should certainly be to do something, there are some cautionary lessons out there. For instance, a recent and actually unpublished for political reasons study in an East Coast state that we were recently exposed to showed that nearly 50 feasibility studies have been completed in that state in the last 5 years, each one extolling similar and highly optimistic projections, and yet not one of those studies has led to an actual construction or deployment of a new fiber network or broadband services. So while everyone does agree that broadband is good, the question becomes, how can we learn from these lessons and avoid time-consuming and expensive dead ends? Our experience is that communities who are actually building networks have a number of commonalities. First, they have a vision. They understand their end goal, and they avoid potential dead ends like requests for information. Two, they have a champion. Three, the community understands ownership and delivery structures. They've accepted that there are trade-offs created around issues of risk and cost and control, and that they understand there's a full, pardon the pun, spectrum of broadband options available. They simply put, move with a purpose. So as we look at the broadband environment, I think fundamentally we can all agree that people in our communities are consuming significantly more content. Videos, data, streaming from residents, employees who want to work from home and telecommute, local businesses that need ever more connectivity to grow and thrive in your communities. Cisco, in fact, projects that global demand will increase nearly 25% per year through 2020. The technologies are getting better and better. Improved electronics and optronics are allowing thousands of connections on a single fiber strand, yet incumbents aren't investing in the upgrades that are necessary. Where they are investing, in some cases, they're cherry picking places that allow them to achieve meaningful economic advantages without addressing issues of digital divide, ubiquity, and all-encompassing coverage. And yet, there has been change. When you look back to 2010, we've seen a significant shift in the national perspective on community-based broadband. In 2010, Google asked communities to raise their hand for an alternative gigabit service called Google Fiber. Nearly 1,100 communities raised their hand. This and the work done in Colorado through SB 152 exemptions have shown that there are alternatives. In fact, the concept of broadband as the fourth municipal utility is really beginning to gain widespread discussion and widespread acceptance. And communities are recognizing that, like railroad expansion in the 1800s, there are going to be winners and losers in the coming race to high-speed broadband. Many are now taking it upon themselves to do something to make sure that they aren't the town without a rail line. And continue that analogy, it's our perspective that we're still in sort of the Wild West phase of this process. There are dozens of ownership and delivery models out there. Some have been successful, some haven't. But we are still in the very early phases and are beginning to see more successes as people begin to learn the lessons that the early adopters have put in front of us. I'd like to spend just a couple of moments discussing some bits and bytes. You can see in the graphic on the right the relative difference in capacity between the old technologies of dial-up and DSL and the massive capacity that's brought by fiber-based gigabit service. The service that offers real solutions both for today and for tomorrow's data demand. The FCC's defined broadband as 25 megabit service down. And for any of you who have 3 kids streaming Netflix while you try to get a large file pulled up on your laptop, you know that 25 gig is only so big of a pipe. Yet even under this definition, most Americans have less than 50 meg. 10% of Americans don't have access to 25 meg service, and nearly 23 million rural Americans, people that live in communities that aren't NFL cities, that aren't major metro areas, are underserved under the current FCC definition. And even where available, we see raging debates around things like data caps and buffering, which limit real high-speed broadband access. If you'd like to check out your own broadband capacity, your own speed, we encourage you to go to www.speedtest.net. You can check your real-time bandwidth from your site either during or after this presentation. Before we go too far, let's just do a high-level look at what is the Internet. The Internet fundamentally exists through a series of connected carrier hotels. This is essentially where your traffic takes the on-ramp to the big World Wide Web. Middle mile networks then connect the big carrier hotels to private or carrier networks locally. Let's say in this instance from Denver to a local network or a provider in Breckenridge, Colorado. Someone, probably a big telecom carrier, has paid to build a connection from your community to the Internet and to carry that traffic back and forth. Locally then, you have opportunities to leverage regional or cooperative partnerships to aggregate volume and carry traffic to the backhaul site. This is an approach that's being explored and utilized across the U.S. that quietly is enabling local communities to reduce the high operating costs and to be able to self-fund broadband expansion. Frequently overlooked, these regional networks can really be crucial to making the business case work and often feature very, very quick paybacks on the invested dollars. Finally, at a local level, you have community fiber networks that are designed to provide city services and anchor institution use, or broadband networks that provide retail fiber services like voice, video, and data directly to business and homes. At a local level, in fact at all of these levels, the technology is necessarily complicated. Transport occurs on multiple platforms and electronics. Software and outside plant assets represent both major technical investments, financial investments, and require significant operational expertise to develop and operate. So given the demand that you're facing from your constituents, we'd really encourage you first to heed the advice of a pretty smart guy named Albert Einstein. Albert once said that he'd spend 55 minutes thinking about a problem and 5 minutes on solution. We believe that our roadmap is a better way to enable you to efficiently get to the point where you can begin to do something. By focusing the community's vision on understanding the challenges, you can avoid missteps that cost you money and, equally important, time delays that prevent you from achieving your ultimate broadband goals for your community. Let's take a look at what types of broadband services people most frequently are talking about in this space. As you begin to think about your path forward, we really want to encourage you to look at the 3 most common models that most communities are evaluating. These models certainly aren't mutually exclusive, and in fact, as we'll discuss, you may start in one area as a building block to move to a more broad or deeper implementation in your communities. And while most communities may feel like, community broadband, the actual retail delivery service to home and businesses, is an end goal, there are things that you can do today in the community fiber, in the regional network space, to help you begin your journey and advance your community's vision. I'd like to look first at the regional and cooperative network model. In many cases, particularly in rural counties, one of the challenges that we face is that governments and community anchor institutions are paying essentially penalty-like rates for access to broadband. One of the most meaningful ongoing expenses of a fiber or broadband network is the ongoing cost of backhaul and traffic costs. A regional and cooperative network looks to offset those costs and enable the construction and implementation of broadband services to those community anchor institutions by aggregating demand and building private networks. In fact, we've seen models that reduce cost of service from as high as $12 a meg to as low as $0.25 a meg, and lead to paybacks on builds with as little as a 3 to 4 year time horizon. Next, I'd like to welcome Dave Xela to the microphone. Dave and his team in Colorado have been highly involved in the creation and implementation of fiber networks in Colorado for the last 5 years, including the creation of one of the first and largest municipal fiber builds in the state, in the town of Centennial. Dave?
Well, Ed, thanks very much, and again, welcome to everybody here on a cold and snowy, most likely for you, Colorado morning. Thanks, Ed, and thanks, Chris, for the wind-up and the pitch there. What I'd like to do is really talk about a couple of case studies and real-life experience, not so much as Ed said about talking about feasibility studies, and they can go on for quite some time, but really talking more about implementation and execution, about how do you move forward and actually, as Ed said, actually do something. So one of the points I'd like to make is that you're probably already very well pre-positioned in your community and may not even know it. And by that I mean that if you look around, you won't see a lot of fiber optics, and that's okay. But if you've got a utility system, we know you do. You probably have they have a SCADA system, or you may have a SCADA system, which is a utility control system. CDOT very likely has some kind of assets that either now do go through your town or will soon be going through your town. So very often they call those intelligent transportation or traffic control, traffic signal systems. Beyond that, utilities are spending a lot of money right now installing automatic meter reading or AMR systems that can be piggybacked very easily. On top of that, one thing that you probably don't think about, and we'll talk here in just a few minutes about, is street lighting. Street lighting is an incredibly powerful asset that you already have. You probably don't own them right now, but you can. We'll talk about those. And then beyond that, there are anchor institutions, schools, hospitals, public safety networks, things that are being built around you invisibly that you can very easily take advantage of. The point there is that one of the benefits are you can really focus on building infrastructure in cooperation or partnership with the private sector. You can also do a lot of public sector partnering, some call it piggybacking as well. But most importantly, that if you remember nothing else really from this morning's presentation, I'd like to just stress how very important it was for us in Centennial, and we built much of that system, by the way, from scratch. But beyond the system, it was the programs that took us to getting the system built. We call them fiber-friendly policies, and we spent probably 2 or 3 years struggling in Centennial to figure out how we work this in partnership, either by mandating or more likely through a public-private partnership, a P3 if you will, installing fiber at what turned out to be pennies on the dollar. And largely it was the fiber-friendly policy program that we developed from scratch that led to Centennial's outstanding success, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But beyond that, beyond those fiber-friendly policies, there are other grants and funding opportunities out there. One of the downsides of Centennial, though, that I'll point out, one of the risks, if you will, about doing it this way with community fiber is that we're not talking about providing broadband, retail broadband to your residents. Rather, it's building a community fiber optic network, really, which is really mainly intended initially, at least anyway, as it was in Centennial, for public use only. And it did take us a number of years. It wasn't like it happened in 6 months, but it was very, very low budget. So that is kind of the wind up for the pitch. I'd like to talk about also repurposing your infrastructure. You know, one question that I'd like to ask, or that we often ask, is, do you own pipes in the ground? And chances are, if you're a city, you're a county government, the chances are, yes, you probably do have either ownership or you have access to pipes in the ground. And then more importantly than even the pipes that you own, do you control how others are placing new pipes under your streets? And the answer there is probably yes. You know, one thing that's really maybe counterintuitive, most people don't think about, is, for example, some of these new technologies coming out now allow you to snake a fiber optic cable inside an electrical conduit, and you can run fiber optics through your existing streetlight conduit system. That's a thought you probably haven't had. But then you think about, well, yeah, but we don't own the conduits that energize or power the streetlights. They're owned by somebody else. Well, we'll talk about that here in a minute, because there are ways you can even work those. The point is, though, that there are a lot of complex interrelationships. There's some incredibly powerful revenue opportunities, ways to either make these very low cost, or we found in Centennial, in many cases, we were able to make the installation of dozens of miles of fiber optic infrastructure funding, and that's a thought you probably haven't had. How can you get somebody else to pay for that? Beyond that, though, really one of the important lessons I'd like to share with you is really how is the fiber optic game really played? In other words, you may be thinking about, hey, let's install some fiber optic cable under this street. Well, it may be incredibly valuable to somebody else, or you may be spending money which has absolutely no value to some real fiber optic or broadband provider. And so we'd like to caution you again, as Ed said, that you can do a lot of things, but you got to be smart about it. And like Einstein said, think your way through first, and then 95% of it is thinking about the problem, and then maybe 5%, as Ed said, is really looking at solutions. I'd like to talk briefly about sharing low cost and existing fiber. Again, so much of the success we saw in Centennial. I also oversaw the Colorado Springs Public Works Agency for about 14 years or so. We've got in the Springs about 400 traffic signals. I think they're approaching about 500 traffic signals now. Most of them are interconnected with fiber, and so much of the fiber optic backbone we built in Centennial and Colorado Springs is largely based on traffic signal interconnect. Again, you've got CDOT fiber, you've got probably city-owned fiber. You may be able to advance broader community goals. The point is, though, that if you already have this stuff in the ground, you don't need to duplicate it again. And as I said earlier, your number one priority beyond, of course, doing a great visioning study is to develop these brand new fiber-friendly policies, starting with what you have already on the books, and then moving those forward through a new program, which is intentional and deliberate to expand a system. And so on that note, the next slide I'd like to show is really what we did in Centennial. Looking at 2010, we began this fiber optic initiative in Centennial back in 2010. And the first thing that we did was we got CDOT to buy into a very simple upgrade. They already had a thin fiber optic cable. One of our staff members, I'll highlight John Merritt and his incredible work there, cut a deal with CDOT. We used some Dr. Cog, which are regional transportation dollars, which weren't even city funds largely, applied that to CDOT, did a deal with them, and next thing you know, we've got a couple miles of city-owned fiber under a state highway. So fast forward from 2010 into where we ended up only 4 short years later, was an incredibly complex system. By the way, every green dot on the map there is a traffic signal. And so 4 years later, fast forwarding, we went from 3 miles in 2010 to over 60, not 16, 60 miles of fiber optic infrastructure. We figured that the cost that we actually poured into it with the city was about $2 per linear foot on average. So the cost was about $600,000, but the value of what we installed was easily at $20 a foot, easily over $6 million. Again, so much of the credit goes to the staff and to a lot of hard work, but really it was deliberately and intentionally done through a fiber-friendly program and a series of policies that we wrote from scratch, and through what we called a co-location program, which has been and will be for quite some time in full swing. Bottom line is, though, in Centennial, yeah, it's a 100,000 population town. When you look at the amount of money per year and divide that by a per capita number, it was only about $1 to $2 per person per year is what it took in Centennial to create just an incredible fiber optic network. And of course, the point is, yes, this could be your community. So on that note, I'd like to point out about the Centennial Approach. Again, pre-2014, they spent so much time developing these pro-fiber policies, setting a vision, and seeing results, very often using other people's money. Some of the benefits were, of course, fewer street cutting permits. And you wouldn't think, well, street cuts, what does that have to do with fiber optics? Initially, it's very hard to connect those dots. But when you think about it, really, the one thing that fiber optics probably has in common with where you want to go is that it's under the public right-of-way. And where we started actually was with the right-of-way permits, revising the street cut program, looking at open trenching, and trying to just reduce potholes, construction, traffic congestion. And as I said, 4 years later, we had this incredible fiber optic infrastructure built for pennies on the dollar. And so really beyond these feasibility studies, so much of this is really all about action. So break, going from Centennial, let's take a trip up into the high country now, up into Vail. Can't claim any credit for what they're doing up there, but I mentioned streetlights earlier. You're probably aware that the next time you go to Vail, you get, it's not free broadband service because, as Ed said earlier, broadband is 25 megabits or faster. So it's not broadband service, but this is a screenshot from my cell phone and a picture that I took in town. This is one of their streetlights. They've got dozens of streetlights now that have fiber optic cables going up through into the device, and then that device on top of the streetlight is it's not broadband transmitter, it's a Wi-Fi transmitter. And so again, it's not very fast. In this case, on this day, this was throwing out about 4 megabits per second, but it's free and it's ubiquitous. It goes to the entire community, and it's really brought to you because of street lighting. And so on the street lighting note, I just wanted to point out that whenever I look at a street light, I look at every street light that I see as a $20 bill dispenser. In other words, the typical cost for a community for a typical street light, you're probably paying right now, it could be $16. Some cities it's as high as $28 in Colorado, but generally speaking, each street light's probably costing you about $20 per light per month. And so you ask, well, okay, how much of that power, how much of that 20 bucks really goes into power and how much goes into profit? Well, you'd be surprised. At most, $4 of the $20 goes into power, and the remaining, maybe it's $16, maybe it's $22, goes into somebody else's profit. Well, you're probably aware that a number of Colorado cities are now looking at municipalizing their street lighting network. I know for those of you in Teller County, I've talked actually to IREA about that. We've talked to Xela Energy about that, and Black Hills Energy. All of them are amenable to selling off all of or working partnerships regarding their street lighting system. Very often a power company looks at street lighting as a liability where the primary business is power. And so cities are now looking at municipalizing the lighting. That fits perfectly in a fiber optic strategy because, as I mentioned, Vail is doing these transmitters now on top of the street lighting system. And by blending these technologies, you're not only saving millions of dollars in cost savings, which you can pour back into developing a fiber optic system, but we're seeing ROIs. One city saw as little as 3 years. Typically, you'll see 5 to 7 years. One city that I spoke with in the Denver area is looking more like an 8-year ROI. But the point is, yes, you buy this infrastructure up front. You're going to save millions of dollars in utility bills that's now going to the power company, and you can reinvest that, by all means, into an incredible fiber optic network. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ed, who'll talk about community broadband services and kind of lead you through some other models that we've worked with here in the area. So Ed, back to you, my friend.
Thanks, Dave. The third and final model that we see most commonly being considered by communities are really the full community broadband service offering. You know, many communities actually begin with deployment of full service to the home, to the business, voice, video, and data services as sort of the peak of the mountain. Many communities, unfortunately, also begin with the belief that they can get someone to build exactly what they want at no cost and continue to allow them to have full control over the resulting network. If you have that hope, we encourage you certainly to begin to change your mindset today. There is no single path to fiber to the premises builds. There are, in fact, dozens of interlinked paths that revolve around the key issues of ownership and service delivery models. Those paths become further confused by complicated issues of risk sharing, cost, and rewards and outcomes. So let's start by understanding how ownership and service delivery models are being utilized right here in the state of Colorado. The first issue that you have to understand is the ownership of built assets. Do you desire a publicly controlled and financed asset? Is there a local cooperative? Or do you need a partnership with a private sector P3 model to help make that vision a reality? Let's look a little more in depth. In the public sector model, a community really takes 100% of the control, finances, and operates the resulting asset. Bonding is frequently used, and complexity and cost are generally high. On the other end of the spectrum, a cooperative, in many cases a power cooperative, seems to leverage the revenue bonding to finance and own deployed assets. There are trade-offs, however, as this entity is now the owner, meaning less direct control by the community itself. In the middle, we've seen dozens of P3 models ranging from heavily privatized with a little sprinkling of public to largely public-owned with an oversalting of private, where ownership, risk, and cost are shared between cities and private entities. These range from Google Fiber to a number of successful P3s across the country, and there are a number of ways to spread risk, but frequently that risk is spread at the cost of a lower amount of control. Your underlying decision really has to revolve around your community's appetite across these 6 factors. For instance, how willing are you to take on the political risk of building a self-financed and self-controlled system? Are you willing to build the capacity inside of your government entity to build and run the system? Building and operating networks is a complex challenge and is often a bigger challenge for smaller municipalities who struggle to have the right people, processes, and technical depth. So once you understand the model, the next step is to determine really the services that you want to deliver and to whom. So let's look first, as we've talked about already to a certain extent with Dave's example about community fiber. As Dave discussed, your focus here is really reducing costs and improving services for public sector and large anchor institutions. You're generally building to government facilities and anchor institutions like fire stations, utility buildings, libraries, and community fiber is often a first milestone because the resulting network ultimately often is used as a backbone for future expansion into more full-service community broadband builds. You'll see a couple of icons here. We'll go through these for each of the service delivery or business models. Service-wise, as we mentioned, you're focused on broadband connectivity with only limited, if any, voice or video services. These are being delivered to government and community anchor institutions. In the community fiber model, you are not delivering broadband to the home or business. Instead, you're servicing the anchor institutions of the community. Governance is generally handled by a governmental or quasi-governmental body, and one of the challenges that you frequently have is that the limited focus of this service doesn't create the broad community impact for residents and businesses that are frequently sought through the SB 152 process. Let's look at a good example of community fiber as it exists in Colorado today. Steamboat Springs is a great example. The community started with the addition about a year and a half ago of a carrier-neutral location. They've recently announced plans to build a $1.5 million fiber ring that will connect 7 anchor institutions, including public safety buildings, an electrical co-op, fire station, a college, a hospital, and the local school district. Interestingly enough, this $1.5 million project will be financed 50% by DOLA. There are grant dollars available to help communities along the road, and this will be planned and governed through an IGA, which is currently being negotiated. It does reduce local control, but again, a great example of how you spread risk and cost amongst various partners. And most importantly, we believe, is this creates a backbone. That backbone advances the city towards a future broadband service offering to homes and businesses should Steamboat Springs decide that that's an eventual step. The second business or service model is the open access model. An open access network has really been a rallying cry for communities who want to expand broadband services but are very reticent or reluctant to compete with the private sector in the actual delivery and deployment of fiber and broadband services to homes and businesses. So in this model, you have, in many cases, an example where the community will take on the cost of deploying the backbone network. Services generally are ultimately going to include voice, video, and data services to homes and businesses. Governance, in many cases, the public entity is going to own and manage the leasing and the budgeting of the fiber assets, while the operation of the actual ISP services are at the discretion of the individual carriers who then come on and purchase access to your network. Staffing is fairly simple. It generally is minimally staffed, frequently receives some support by outside consultants or experts around leasing and leasing issues. But there are challenges. There are no guarantees that anyone will come. And in many cases, providers can be very selective about which assets and which routes they want to serve. specifically serving high-value or dense residential areas, which has the unintended consequence in many cases of increasing the digital divide between the haves and the have-nots relative to broadband services. A good example, as Dave talked earlier, Centennial is now expanding its service from its municipal fiber routes 3 to 4 years ago, and is now spending close to $6 million to pass close to every home and business with a broadband-ready fiber network. Ting has announced it will be the first overbuilder and will begin to lease fiber to provide services. And you can see in this model that cost and complexity are low, but ultimately there is some surrendering of control, since the community does not know when or even if providers will actually come. We have seen instances across the U.S. where providers have agreed to provide services over open access networks, and then after months or in some cases years of negotiation may have walked away from those commitments, leaving the community with a built network and still no services provided. Finally, and most probably recognized, is the municipally owned and run broadband service model. This is probably the place where if you asked your citizens who participated in SB 152 votes what they had in mind, they're probably looking at this. They're probably thinking about a full-service retail product that goes to consumers and businesses. It's probably a triple voice, video, or data, or voice and data product. It requires the community to think aggressively about how to staff a full retail product, staffing across marketing, technology, sales, service, field support. And governance is generally via a government department, or in the case of a P3 with some sort of corporate or private structure. The challenges here are really revolve around the fact that this entity does compete with incumbent providers. You know, you're running a private business, essentially a competitor to private business, and it requires complex skill sets that some communities don't possess at the point of implementation. Great example, and one of the great success stories out of Colorado today is the city of Longmont, which utilized and leveraged its existing public electric utility to provide NextLight service, broadband service. The community has taken 100% of the risk, all of the cost and the complexity, but they've also maximized the impact. They've seen incredible take rates. Their charter membership program and lifetime guaranteed pricing for gigabit service has driven take rates well above projections, and they are on path to significantly outperform their original pro forma models. Obviously, in many of these cases, if you are going to be an owner and have an ownership stake, there are financing alternatives that you need to be aware of. Those alternatives include grants and programs at the state, local, and federal level, as well as bonding and financing options should the community have a stake in the cost of the build and the build out. At HR Green, we were certainly happy to assist you in identifying and evaluating some of these options, and in many cases, the acquisition of grant or program funding, in addition to bond funding, there's a complex interweaving of those two funding types that really does make a full build or a partial build possible. So given everything we've talked about, where should you start and how can you learn from the lessons that are being given in other communities? At HR Green, we believe there's a fundamental flaw in today's feasibility study-driven models, and that is that communities often head down an expensive path, leads to a time-consuming RFI, and looks back a year later at limited progress because simply they failed to follow Einstein's advice. They invested time and energy to examine the problem up front. Even worse, maybe they just don't want to have to make the hard choices required to do something. So instead, spend months or years admiring the problem via committee or through multiple repeated RFI or RFP processes. Our belief is that If your first step is a desire to complete a costly feasibility study, we can hit some of the highlights for you here. It will tell you that your community wants better broadband, preferably gigabit. It will tell you they want choice, that they want the ability to stream HD, they want it at half the price, and they want it right now. It'll say all of the following. It'll likely suggest that there's a break-even point at about a 28% take rate, that you have access to fiber, you have powers you didn't know, and that it's hard, and you need experience to put it all together. Chances are that that study will tell you it is feasible. But we believe that before you expend that energy to complete the planning process, that you can invest a small fraction of that amount building community vision and preparing yourself for progress. Our Envision process will help you determine your appetite for risk, both political and financial. We'll help you evaluate what broadband means, not to the world, but to your community members and what they want, and we'll help you strike a direction, and only then move into the stages where you can advance the work. Planning, design, build, and operations are certainly important processes. You know, we want to help you move through the process to design and build and thus to operations if that is your goal. But these are the last 5 minutes. These are the things that you do after you've set the vision. They're incredibly important, but they don't make up for a lack of strongly defined upfront goals. Dave, I'd like to hand it back to you for a couple of final thoughts, and we can wrap up and answer some questions that the attendees may have.
You bet, Ed, and glad to see we're actually running a little ahead of schedule. That's great, and thanks for the questions already. A few of them have come in, so we'll get to those in just a few minutes. So just the last part I'd like to talk about here are really lessons learned, looking back from someone, including those of us here at HR Green who've done a number of these around the state. Some of the key attributes of successful broadband deployments I'd like to talk about. One is, as Ed said, the Einstein quote, you need to have buy-in and clarity. Set your vision up front. Think about the problem before you start thinking about solutions. That's huge. That's very important. Likewise, from experience, I can tell you that a cross-functional, some cities or towns or counties may call it a cross-functional fiber team. And very often IT people, they're incredible. They understand the bits, the bytes, as we call them, the ones and zeros. They're incredibly valuable. And it's also important, though, to have public works people on that cross-functional team. Again, so much of the Centennial success, when you look at Longmont's success, you look at Vail's success, one thing that they all seem to have in common is they've got a very strong public works element to it. I talked to one city engineer in a mountain town recently. He says, Dave, please don't get me sucked into this thing. I've got enough on my plate already. But the reality is really is that those public works people, at least experience shows, are crucial in advancing that vision forward. Whether it's looking at street cuts, looking at co-locations, somebody's digging a hole over here. Well, why are they digging a hole? What pipe are they putting in? Well, they're probably putting in a piece of fiber optic cable, and is there a chance for piggybacking or co-location, or as we did in Centennial, you put it in for pennies on the dollar while there's already a hole in your street. Well, again, it's the traffic engineers, it's the city engineers, it's those public works people who readily know when a hole is being cut in the street and where those opportunities are out there. So really, on the cross-functional fiber team, you need to bring in some public works people, engineers, and experienced, of course, people that can assist you with that. Partnering with anchor institutions is also very important. As Ed mentioned earlier, looking for where can you piggyback and without having to rebuild parts of your network, can you lease fiber strands? Can you lease a buffer tube, which is a bundle of strands? Can you just lease capacity on those strands? As Ed mentioned earlier, yeah, you can get 20,000 houses right now on a single strand. That's an amazing amount of capacity. You may not get that in a neighborhood, but you can get that on some of your main transmission lines, and you only need a few of those to light up a whole city. Next slide here, I'd like to talk about also other lessons learned and other things you can do right now within your own city are involving economic development advocates. Sometimes cities, towns, or counties may have internal economic development people. That may be the town manager. It could be somebody whose full-time job it is, or it could be a chamber of commerce. Those people can be huge supporters and advocates because they understand how valuable this whole fiber optic and broadband world can be. Ed, I think, hit the nail on the head when he talked about funding opportunities and generating revenue immediately. Again, back to what we did in Centennial, we were able to revise the Centennial Street Cut program with a fiber optic flavor in mind. We increased the fees for street cuts, but we also increased the requirements, and in a number of cases, many cases, a lot of those miles were built not only for no cost, but for a negative cost. That is, we were able to generate revenue immediately for the fiber program from the public works street cut fee system, which all plays back through itself. So keep in mind, there's so many revenue generating opportunities. The street lighting opportunities I mentioned, that's a cost avoidance, but if you take that money and pour it back into a fiber network, you'd be surprised and amazed at how quickly, and actually it's a lot of work, but how quickly you can start to build revenue that you didn't know you had, either by bringing in new revenue or, as I said, by avoiding costs. And then likewise, creating a sustainable, dynamic, and a municipal-centric fiber. I'd like to underscore, and this is a foot stomper for me, developing that fiber program is absolutely essential. That has so many parts to it. It's all internal to the city. But for example, when a developer brings in a roll of blueprints, says, look at these are what I want to build in your community, well, the first question is, where's your fiber? What streets are you digging up, and how can we work this from a planning department perspective? How can we bring in the public works people? And yes, what can IT share with it? But those kinds of opportunities really are involving not just a series of policies, but it's an entire multi-year program. It's not fast. It may or may not be cheap, but it can be very, very powerful, as we found in Centennial, building 60 miles in about 4 years. So again, the result is incredibly improved service at probably very low cost, and of course each city will be different, and we need to customize that to your own needs. And then the last slide really I'd just like to talk about is, of course, we're here to help. HR Green can do these visioning studies. We can share with you, and we can bring out these preliminary, or some call them critical assessments. We can obviously work, and a very key part of it is the public engagement. What does your community want? Every town is different. Every county is different. Every goal will be different. We can help evaluate those. We can clarify the outcomes. As Ed said, we can looking at risks and rewards, costs, benefits, doing an AOA, an analysis of alternatives. All these things really come together into a very powerful vision study that may lead you into a full-fledged feasibility study that you can take to the bank and say, bankers, look, we've got the detail now. We need to have a $2 million loan to advance this thing. But the feasibility study is really, in a sense, less important than that upfront vision study. And then lastly, the number one foot stomper I'd like to leave you with is creating that fiber-friendly program. That's looking at the development side of your community, what's going on in terms of who's working where, what new things are going on in your community, and what we call staff augmentation services. So in Centennial, by the way, they outsourced to one of our HR Green staff members, for what it's worth. So much of the work that came in, every time a street cut came in, it went straight to one of our great staff members, looked at it, decided, hey, we need to go talk to these people. There's an opportunity for partnership on these are one-by-one opportunities. Very time-consuming. You may not have the time to do that, but when you look at it comprehensively, what's the beginning, what's the end point of that thing? As I said, this can be a very, very powerful program and involves all these planning, public works, and IT people in a cross-functional team. So on that note, I just wanted to, again, thank everyone. I think we're running just a little ahead of schedule. That's good. Ed, Chris, other thoughts, comments, or suggestions? If there's questions, by all means, feel free to send them in through the chat box that's open on the screen right now. So Ed and Chris, I'll turn it back to you. Again, thanks so much.
Thanks, Dave. This is Chris. At this time, we can field questions from the audience. I have been getting them in, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Some questions were very similar, such as will the slides or the recording be available afterwards? And the answer is yes. We'll follow up with everyone and can provide that information. Another question here came in from Tim. It says, interested in knowing more about municipal delivery via water and sewer systems. Dave or Ed, you want to address that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. This is Dave again. Absolutely, yeah, water and sewer can be very powerful from a number of areas. And so if you're overseeing a water or sewer operation right now, and many cities do in Colorado, of course, there are hundreds of districts as well. But if you're overseeing a water or wastewater operation, 2 or 3 thoughts come to mind. One is automatic meter reading. That was the AMR slide that I had up a while ago, or AMI, which is automated metering instrumentation. basically, when a toilet flushes in a house, many systems are now being connected and paid for with utility revenue bonds very often to improve those AMR systems, the AMI systems, or the SCADA systems, which are the big pumps and part control systems. But utility systems are investing a lot of money. We've got a system in Colorado Springs for which the city utility department spent millions of dollars to doing automatic meter reading through copper wires, and it's completely, sadly, inadequate to use for fiber optic program. Had they only upgraded from a twisted pair copper into every house in town to fiber optic cable, you can then split that very easily and light up a house very easily. Plenty of capacity for gigabit service in a house, and pulling back down to the utility agency all the AMR or AMI data that you need to run your utility system. So I'm not sure that I've explained that well enough, but also one slide that Ed had up about 10 minutes ago talked about special districts. And you know, here in Colorado, there are many, many special districts. So we even have one legal opinion that we were part of developing that said, hey, can a special district do this? And so you may be a city that doesn't have any water department in that. That's okay, because a special district can do this. In fact, I spoke just a few weeks ago to the annual Special District Association up at Keystone. Had quite a lot of interest in special districts providing that. And so back to the partnership thing, yes, you may not have a water department, but you could partner with your water district, allow them to use their revenue bonds, use their fiber, and then decide up front to split or share or partner with them. So water district gets all the AMR data that they need, and then your municipal government can use the municipal retail broadband or any models, as Ed talked about earlier. So kind of rambling here. One last thought. I know that one city that we've worked with is using abandoned water pipes as fiber optic conduits. That's a bit counterintuitive. One of the lessons learned there is, of course, fiber doesn't go through a valve very easily, so you've got to go through and pull the valves or permanently make sure that those abandoned valves are open, obviously. But yeah, if you've got 10 or 15, 20 miles of water pipes under your main streets, those can make excellent conduits for snaking fiber optic cable through. So yeah, there's probably 3 answers to your one question, but yes, absolutely, water organizations are very well pre-positioned for these fiber infrastructure networks.
All right, thanks, Dave. I'm going to go to the next couple of questions here. A few I'm going to group together, but first I'm going to ask this one from Ben. He said, with Google going away from fiber, should we all be paying attention and taking note? Is there new technologies, i.e. wireless, that we should be looking at?
Yeah, Dave, I'd be happy to take a run at this one. I think Google has certainly admitted that they are tapping the brakes on the implementation of fiber. I think on the surface it may appear to be purely a technology decision, a delivery technology decision. As you peel back the onion a little bit, what you'll find is that is also largely a response to the fact that the incumbent providers have been fiercely protecting things like their pole right and attachment rights, and really delaying the ability of Google to get out in the field and implement its fiber-based network. I think having said that, fiber probably still remains the tried and true technology solution for widespread deployments, but in many cases, particularly I think in some of the deployments in mountainous terrain, very low density terrain, that wireless deployments could have a place. And in many cases, the architecture of a deployment could include both wireless and wired fiber assets. It really is a unique solution for each community, but I wouldn't assume that Google's brake tapping is exclusively because they've decided that wireless is a better technology to tackle the solution.
You know, Ed, you've raised a couple of excellent points. I've talked to actually the head of Google Fiber deployment a number of times about a number of specific situations. A couple thoughts that he left me with. You know, one, as Ed said, is much of their frustrations coming from cities that have a lot of aerial cable needs versus underground cable. And so back to the Centennial experience, you know, the 60 miles that we put in Centennial, that was all underground. In fact, Google was very interested in looking at cities where there's a higher percentage of underground versus aerial, But if the aerial is owned by a single entity, so for example, the city of Austin, Texas, owns the utility rights, or if you can cut a deal with your local power company, one example there is, well, maybe you offer the power company, hey, we will put in city fiber on your power company-owned poles, and we will give you, the power company, AMR abilities by stringing this through the aerial system, stringing it overhead, if you allow us to use the fiber network that we're going to pay for to light up and provide retail service to the city. And so really each situation, like Ed said, is really different. On the Vail experience, again, back to those street lights, if you own the street lights, those become the nodes which could become future transmitters, as Vail's doing. They're not doing broadband, they're doing Wi-Fi, but those street lights with new technologies can do point-to-point wireless, and you can get gig service out of both Wi-Fi systems, and there's a new technology coming down. It's probably 2 to 3 to 4 years away, not called Wi-Fi, but called Li-Fi, which is an infrared-based system where the street light flashes, and you can get, I think it's now 3 or 4 gigs per second off of a flashing street light. Again, if you own the street light and you got fiber to it, those are nodes, and those nodes, if you can see a street light from grandma's bedroom window, grandma can pull down at least a gig service from the flashing street light, as long as you have line of sight to that point. So yes, again, every system is different. I think Google is having to retreat a bit and move in some different directions. Technology is advancing, but would love to work with you and analyze what you have, what you might be able to get, and see what technologies might work for you.
All right, thanks, Ed and Dave. We have 4 minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in at least one, maybe 2 questions. A couple of these I'm combining 2 of them. So the next one is, how long will it take to develop a fiber-friendly study? And another one was, how long does a visionary study take? So maybe address the length of how long these studies would take for the audience, please.
Ed, you want to talk about that, or I can do it from experience? Either way.
Sure, Dave. I think I can certainly speak to the study side. In most cases, I think the feasibility study, a full feasibility study, which, as we've discussed, many communities take as in our opinion, maybe an unfortunate first step down the road of deploying broadband, can take as long as 9 to 12 months. We believe that a visioning study can be completed in probably 2 to 3 months with the full commitment of resources and time and availability, potentially even shorter than that. Relative to the development and implementation of fiber-friendly policies, Dave, I'd probably defer to you as an expert on that.
Certainly, it's fiber-friendly policies really depends on what you have on the books already. I'd say 1 to 2 months. Again, so much of this can be done working with the current city staff. We can help train the staff. We can augment the staff to do the work. But digging into your books really to look to see what kind of work is being done now, what kind of permitting systems do you have. One big question is, what's your franchise agreement look like? And then looking across franchise agreements, street cut permitting, talking about the reality of the politics, which can be either easy or difficult. But under a best case scenario, you can completely revise those. I'd say what we did find is that the resolutions are good, ordinances are better when you're working with an elected official body. But if an ordinance takes, as it does here in Colorado, takes 2 readings to get an ordinance through, that probably half the time is just getting it through your elected officials. So I'd say probably 1 to 2 months to do the actual work, and then depending on your own processes, 1 to 2 months to get it approved and implemented. So certainly by mid-spring, you can be up and running easily with these fiber-friendly policies, and hopefully get some revenue generating coming off of that as well. So it's a lot of work, but it's not that time consuming.
All right, thanks. And then one final question. I'm going to make this a 2-parter because I'm combining a few from people. They wanted to know if HR Green could help write or prepare an RFI or an RFP. They weren't sure which direction to take. And then secondly, if HR Green was available to present to their council or other key staff that have questions or unsure of the direction to take. And then we'll wrap it up with this question.
Well, I would say yes to both. Ed, you want to talk about RFI versus RFP, and then I can talk about maybe taking the show on the road and helping out some communities with their elected officials. But the RFI, RFP question, Ed, you want to take that one?
Sure. Absolutely. We certainly understand that that in many cases communities have a responsibility, fiduciary responsibility to go through a request for process. As I've mentioned, you may hear a bias. This is not a use HR green bias by any means. It's simply a bias away from RFIs. We would strongly encourage communities to consider how to develop an internal vision and how to move to that versus throwing out to the world, what can you bring to us? In many cases, the answers to that what can you bring to us question will be so wide and varied as to really not provide any real guidance. Providers, potential partners, would much rather prefer seeing a strongly worded RFP with a strong direction. For those communities out there that feel that they're at the spot where they're looking for assistance, if there is something that HR Green can do to help you through the preparation of your RFP, we certainly have seen samples from across the country, and we'd be happy to provide some developmental assistance. Or I'm sure, as Dave will say, happy to come out and meet a little more in person with your city manager or elected officials.
Yeah, Ed, and thank you for stealing my thunder. That's exactly what I was going to say. Absolutely, that depending on the timing and who all's where, we can do this. We can do a lot of that. We can do an encore presentation. I've also done this, as I mentioned, a number of other times. We've got some longer versions of this where we get into some more of the technical details. We can go down some tangents if you like, and we can walk through. In fact, I just had a request this morning to give a more in-depth detailed presentation to a Denver metro area city that will be setting something up for next week. So absolutely, if you folks would like some more information, either with a small group of staff members, one thing that we enjoy doing very often is just doing a lunch and learn. We've done that several times now. We're just bringing your key staff people in public works, in IT, in planning, development, economic development. Bring them all in. We'll buy a couple of pizzas. We'll do a working lunch, if you will, and we can walk through any number of versions and go down any number of tangents you like. I'd be happy to host those. Give us a call. We can do it, as I said, either in person or these webinars are very, very easy. We can set those up with usually just a couple days' notice. So again, we're here. We're happy to help. We think we've got the best team, obviously, around. We've got a lot of experience. We'd like to share it with you and help you avoid some time-consuming and costly missteps and learn from the experience of others. So with that, Ed, Chris, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks again for all your help and for listening in.
Sure, thank you, and we thank the audience for joining us and the participants for providing questions, and thank Ed and Dave for giving a great presentation and discussion. You will be receiving an email follow-up from us, and in there we'll provide links to the information, slides, and the recording that for you. So again, thank you very much for your time, and have a nice afternoon.